pandemics, and it is worth noting that even though pandemics are unusual for us, it is clear when you read ancient sources that human beings have gone through this before, and they just, I mean, they existed till it burnt out, obviously. Neither Pfizer nor any other company came to the rescue. But let us hope that they do in our day, and that in the meantime, everyone stays safe. Some people, however, lived to a good long life, even in ancient times, which brings us to Sarah. This week's portion is Chaye Sarah, the life of Sarah. Now, how long Sarah lived is obviously, I mean, part of the question is how much you believe the numbers that are given in the Torah. Methuselah was supposed to have lived 969 years, which is a good long life, but you are entitled to some degree of skepticism that, in fact, he lived 969 years, and Sarah lived 127, and again, you are entitled to some degree of skepticism if you wish. You might think that she really could not really have made it past 115 or 16. Whatever you decide is okay with me, because again, the truths of the Torah are not dependent on the accuracy of the details of the facts. And the truth of Sarah's life is what we're going to explore a little bit today. Now, I want to start by talking in general about the position of women in the Torah. And this is not at all going to be comprehensive. I just want to make a couple of observations before we get to the text about where women were in the Torah and later. There was a well-known article actually many years ago by Rabbi Friedman that talked about this in terms of the difference between the position of women in the Torah and in Talmudic times, because in the Talmud, it seems women play less of a public role and less of a religious role as a whole than they do in the Torah. That's not true of all women. There are exceptions. The most famous exception is Bruria, and those of you who are interested, I've written an article about Bruria that was published in Mosaic magazine, and Bruria was a distinguished and brilliant woman in the Talmud, but she's pretty rare, extremely rare, virtually unique. In the Torah, however, the position of women is more complicated than simply their being voiceless. In the Torah, the initial story, of course, of Adam and Eve already suggests that women have a greater alertness and curiosity and willingness to experiment and find out about the world than men do. Because if you read the story, Adam is basically a bump on a log, and Eve is the one who tastes the fruit and gives it to Adam, who takes it from her. But it's a double-edged sword, because that's supposed to be an evil act. So it's not clear what exactly it means in terms of the Torah's view of men and women. And then later on, when we come to this story, that is the story of Abraham and Sarah, you get a very different view. Remember that when Sarah can't have children and wants Abraham to mate with Hagar, God says to Abraham explicitly, whatever Sarah tells you to do, you should do. That already leads the rabbis to speculate that Sarah had greater powers of prophecy in some ways than Abraham does. But it also means that the motive force behind a lot of the public action of the world is women, even if they themselves were not yet in the public sphere. And that's what you find again and again. And in particular, there is no portion named Abraham, but this portion is Chaye Sarah, the life of Sarah. And it begins, Chaye Sarah, with Sarah's death. And that's the first of two principal points that I want to explore. Now, again, whatever Torah you want to use, whatever translation you want to use is up to you. I have a whole bunch of them, but I usually use the JPS Tanakh. But I will give you, for example, the translation, since I happen to have it handy, and why not, of the Steinsaltz Chumash from the late and great Rav Adin Steinsaltz, who begins the translation in Chaye Sarah with the following words. The lifetime of Sarah was 127 years, the years of the life of Sarah. And that repetition is important. Vayu Chaye Sarah mea shana ve'esrim shana v'sheva shanim. That's the first part. The years of Sarah's life were 120 and 7. And there the rabbis like the idea that, she was 100. She kept her youth. That's why it separates the 100 and the 20 and the 7. She kept her youth as a young person even when she was 100. And then it says, Shnei Chaye Sarah. Those were the years of Sarah's life. So the commentators obviously rush in that based on a comment by Rashi, but Rashi almost always bases it on Talmudic comments as well. Rashi is a kind of curator and shaper to a great extent of the Talmudic commentaries. That Sarah's essential character, her outlook on life, her ability to deal with things at 7, at 20, at 100 were the same. Not in a negative sense, not her ability to deal with things at 100 was a 7-year-old, but rather she had the blessing of a consistent character throughout her life. That each day she had a certain shalvat nefesh, a certain peace of soul, a certain determination, a certain ability to face things, a certainty that things would be okay, that characterized her from the beginning of her life to the end of her life. The one great challenge, I think, to this interpretation, of course, is the question of Hagar and Ishmael, and that she then becomes upset and wants Ishmael out of the house. But it depends how you look at that story. And in any case, the rabbis here are enunciating an ideal. And the ideal is that the swings of life, the sort of semi-manic depressive differences that we manifest in our moods, were not the way Sarah conducted herself or lived her life. And that she was able to be calm, resolute, kind, all the things she was all the time, so that she could leave Ur Kasdim with Abraham. She could go through a war with him, don't forget. She could twice be passed off as his sister in foreign lands and understand and still be a part of his life. That she could retain her beauty, because remember that he says before he goes into Egypt, now I see how beautiful you are. And that was long into their marriage. That she could laugh when hearing she was going to have a child, right? As opposed to be bitter. She could have a child at an advanced age, whether 99, 100, or just old. We don't know. Torah says, but I mean, ages are not. You don't have to put your hand on the Bible to agree with the biblical age. But she managed somehow to have that resolution and that determination, and that may be why. It may be why Sarah is the first person in the Bible who is eulogized. And in fact, in the Torah, only 2 people are eulogized, because it says explicitly, Abraham arose before his dead and spoke. So to the children of Chet, and then he gets the place for her, the first burial. that we have. And then once he buries her, it says in verse where is it? Forgive me. Where am I? I'm losing it. To bury my dead and eulogize them, and that is only true. The only other person who is eulogized apart from Sarah is Jacob. Other people are buried, but only Sarah and Jacob get eulogies, and we could speculate on why those two. But for the moment, let's leave the speculation aside and just think about the fact that Abraham eulogizes Sarah. Now, that he does, it says, Vavraham lispod Sarah v'livkota, which here it says Abraham proceeded to mourn for Sarah and bewail her, but lispod is hesped, a eulogy. So you could translate lispod as mourn, but also it could be translated as eulogize, and I think I like that translation better. And we can only imagine in part who Abraham was talking to. Before whom did Abraham eulogize his wife? Before the surrounding Hittites? Perhaps so. They must have known her. She lived among them. Before Isaac? Perhaps so. Maybe to himself. But Sarah's qualities were manifest to him, and he mourns and eulogizes her. And that already says something about the importance and the place of Sarah in Abraham's life and in the biblical narrative that is both powerful and important. Here is somebody whose life becomes the title of the Parsha, is drawn out in a way that calls attention to the richness of her years, and also then Abraham eulogizes her in a manner that suggests to us, since it is so unusual in the Torah, that there are things to be said about Sarah and her character that are important and lasting. So, what is Sarah's legacy, and why is she important, even apart from a genealogical sense? Well, I think that the first thing to keep in mind is that Genesis is quintessentially a book of family, and Sarah and Abraham are the first family. And that the tone that is set at the beginning is one that has a profound influence on subsequent generations. Remember, Isaac becomes comforted for the loss of his mother when he meets his wife, which already gives you the sense of continuity. Isaac must find another. He finds Rivka. Well, he doesn't find Rivka, but Eliezer does, which we may come back to. But when Rivka is found and Isaac sees her, and right away they understand that they are destined for one another, it is as a comfort for the loss of Sarah that Isaac falls in love. And that simple statement that he's comforted for the loss of his mother by seeing Rivka speaks volumes about Isaac's relationship with his mother, because we don't really know his relationship. We have a lot about his relationship with his father in certain ways because of the Akedah, but we don't really know about his relationship with his mother, although there are midrashic hints of their closeness, because remember that it says that the Midrash says that the reason that Sarah's death is right after the Akedah is because the Malach, the evil angel, the Satan, the oppositional angel, went and told Sarah, guess what? Your husband has taken your son up to the mountain to offer him as a burnt offering. And Sarah was so shocked that she died, had a heart attack and died from that statement. Now, this is a midrash. It's not in the Torah, but it does say something about the rabbi's perception of the closeness of mother and son. Remember, Isaac is her only child, and it took a long time to get an Isaac. And so that deep bond and intimacy, we might have presumed, but the Torah doesn't leave us with the presumption alone. Instead, it spells it out in those two very subtle ways. One, having Sarah die right after the Akedah, and two, by talking about how Isaac is comforted from the loss of his mother when Rivka is found as his wife. So there is that. There is the beginning of the parent-child bond in a deep way that starts with Sarah. And though it is always rocky because families are families, it will be the nucleus of the subsequent stories in Genesis. Remember Rivka and Jacob and Esau, and then Rachel and Leah and the tribes. It goes on and on. So that's one part of the legacy of Sarah. The other part of the legacy of Sarah is, of course, that she stands by Abraham through all the vicissitudes and difficulties of his life. And as I said, at least according to the Torah, manages nonetheless to keep calm and to be the founding mother of the Jewish people. And then the third, which is a really extensive and important legacy, although we don't maybe think of it this way. The third is the legacy of burial and mourning. Sarah is the first person buried in the Torah and the first person mourned for and eulogized. It is not to say that previous people weren't mourned for and eulogized, and obviously they died, but this is the beginning of a different sort of tradition. There is, in the Bible at least, there is a recognition of the quasi-finality of death and the appropriateness of mourning when someone dies. I say quasi-finality because, and this is a subject for another time, I don't want to suggest that the Torah doesn't have in its mind the possibility that people live on in other worlds. I'm going to leave that aside, but it certainly does feel that the end of one's life in this world is a cause for sadness and for mourning. And that those who are left behind are charged with the responsibility of taking care both of the physical remains and also of the memory of those who have died. And so the first piece of real estate that is purchased in the Torah in the land of Israel is Me'arat HaMachpelah, which is the cave where the patriarchs and matriarchs are buried. And this weird, powerful, ironic reality that the first place that we see Abraham buy land in Israel is to bury someone also speaks to the way in which the land is bound up both in sacrifice and in memory. So in that sense, too, Sarah is of Israel, the first one who is of Israel. You know the poem, I think it's Wilfred Owen, the great English poet, that there's a part of the world and a piece of it will always be England, right? In other words, there are English soldiers buried there, and as long as they're buried there, a piece of that world, England will always be there. So once you are buried in a place, you are of that place in a deep sense, even though you carry the legacy of the place you came from. Now it's a part of another world that you carry it to. And so for Sarah, she's the first place of where someone would come to visit. Isaac, presumably, would visit Sarah's grave. Abraham purchases Sarah's grave. And her burial there is the first time that a Jew is buried in the land of Israel. And that's already a very powerful statement about. It reminds me, I was just thinking, I was trying to think of this while I was talking, and different parts of my brain were at battle with each other. But what I was trying to remember was that there was a British soldier who was Jewish, who was killed. I don't remember if it was before the War of Independence, around the War of Independence. And at that time, it was very hard to get remains back to another country. So they buried him in Israel. And what they put on his gravestone, which I think is still in the military cemetery in Israel, they said, far from the place of his birth, but at home. And that's true of Sarah. Far from the place of her birth, but at home. So Farnaz asked what was her best quality. According to the rabbis, her best quality was, I think, the quality that is, in some ways, the most important quality to lead a good life, which is resilience. That she went through all these various, very difficult stages of life and experiences of life. And she managed nonetheless to survive and to raise a child and to start an entirely new tradition together with Abraham that the world had not known. So some might say that that resilience came from faith. So in which case you would say faith was her greatest quality. We don't have direct evidence of that exactly the way we do with Abraham, but certainly, I think we have a lot of evidence of Sarah's resilience and her ability to enable that which had to be to continue, in some ways resting on her back, and that's a very, very powerful legacy and a difficult one exactly to enunciate, because I can't tell you 10 stories about Sarah the way we can tell you stories about Abraham. But the fact that she was able to continue this way and to do this is a powerful tribute to her strength. I think that that's the right word. That she had strength, because to keep even through rocky times requires strength as well as faith. And I think that it's not unrelated to the times in which we live, after all. To see difficulty as well as joy, and in Kipling's word, to treat those two imposters just the same, that is, to be able to have an evenness of spirit in times of darkness as well as in times of great joy, that's That's what we all should aim for to some extent. To be able, not that you shouldn't have moods or passions, but there should be deep inside, at the core of a human being, as I think the rabbis see in Sarah, a stability, something that cannot be shaken, that you are who you are. And maybe part of this is related, and I think it's fair to say, to self-knowledge and self-certainty, that Sarah knew who she was, and therefore couldn't be pulled out of the orbit um, of her own values and life path. And that's why, presumably, she could even instruct Abraham, this is what you should do, because she could see things clearly, even though in some ways, perhaps she couldn't predict other people's behaviors as clearly as she could understand her own. So she didn't understand what it would mean for Hagar to have a child in the house of her mistress. But that's a complicated story, and one that challenges some of our assumptions about Sarah and Hagar and Abraham, and would require, I think, its own session to discuss. Nonetheless, there clearly is that, and there is, I think, no other person, no other woman for whom a parsha is named, and the one other thing to say about Sarah, which is really important, is that for all of her gifts and for all that she has given, she does suffer from the disability that women have suffered from for thousands of years, which is, next to the men in her world, she is relatively voiceless. And her influence, while as profound as Abraham's, because presumably she's the one who shaped Isaac, just as Rebecca is the one who shaped her children, while as profound as Abraham's, is not spoken. She is missing in the story to a much greater extent. Abraham is, and I actually, one of the ways that I first became aware of what this voicelessness means is when I first started to go out speaking. I would often have people who would say to me, Wolpe, I knew your father years ago, but because my mother's maiden name was hidden in my own, because I didn't go out in my mother's maiden name, there weren't people who came up to me and said, oh, I remember your mother when she was a little kid, because they didn't necessarily know, unless they had known my parents as a couple. And that was one of the subtle ways in which my mother's voice was less obvious. There were other ways too. My father was a rabbi and he spoke all the time, but women's voices were lost to a great extent to history, and they made their appearance through the voices of their children, who became their public voice. And Sarah's too is a much less prominent voice in the Torah than Abraham's. And in that sense, we lost something, because we lost the words that Sarah might have spoken, some of them that might have been beautiful and powerful, but we don't have them. And so that's why when we come to Rivka, and Rivka arranges for Jacob to steal the birthright, and you say, well, what's this all about? In some deep way, I think Rivka understands that this is the way in which she can exercise her power as a woman through her son, because she cannot do it directly, because she's not in a society that gives her the same kind of voice as it gives to men. And Sarah has that as well. So we have to extrapolate. We have to try to guess about Sarah's character in a way to understand what it is that she believed in and valued and all of that. So I'm looking to see if I can find any other comments or questions to respond to. So if you have any, feel free to put them in the chat or in the chat, in the whatever, the YouTube something or the Facebook page. But the one other comment that I want to make about the Parsha itself is also in a way related to Sarah, although not exactly. And it's a comment I've made before, but it's really, I think, important for us to hear, which is the next chapter goes on, Avraham Zaken Baba Yamin. Abraham was old, advanced in years. Hashem berech et Avraham bakol. And God blessed Abraham in everything. Now, if you think about that statement, it's very strange because Abraham had a really difficult life, really difficult life. He left his home. He left his family. He was involved in a war. He had to face famine. He had to pass his wife off as his sister. He can't have a child. Then when he finally has a child, Ishmael, child is thrown out of the house. Then he takes the other child up to the mountain to sacrifice. I mean, this is not an easy family situation that Abraham finds himself in. He would today, right? He would probably require a combination of like Dr. Phil and private therapy and God only knows to try to sort all this out. But nonetheless, it says Berech Avraham Bakol, that God blessed him in everything. And the import of this seems to be God gave Abraham the privilege of seeing every side of life. And that means that Abraham saw darkness as well as light. He saw difficulty and pain as well as triumph and joy. That he didn't just see the good side, he saw kol, all of it. And all of it, in this case also, is the relationship with Sarah. Because like in any relationship, there were good years and there were difficult and bad years. There were times that he managed to find his way to Sarah, right? There were those moments. And then there were times when he was estranged, around the time of Hagar, and I'm sure around the wife-sister stories. And that too is a kind of blessing of everything. Because when I've done, especially funerals, but sometimes 50th anniversary or whatever for couples, they rarely, and when they do, you can't entirely believe them, say, every day has been nothing but a joy. No, they say something much deeper and more profound and more beautiful. We've had difficult times. We've had wonderful times. We've had challenges. We've had joys, but we managed to do it together. And that's what Abraham and Sarah could say at the end of Sarah's life. And so profound is that there's, there is a coda. It's not like Abraham doesn't have any more children. Abraham has more children after Sarah dies. He marries a woman called Keturah, who some rabbis associate with Hagar, as though he went back and married Hagar after Sarah died, possibly, or Keturah, whoever. None of those children, though, figure in the story. They're mentioned, and then they're gone. It's Isaac. Isaac is the one who carries on the story, which means that in some powerful way, the determinative person was not Abraham, it was Sarah. And that's why Abraham's other children, despite the fact that they're born to Abraham, they mean nothing to the subsequent story, but Sarah's child is the one who will carry the legacy of the Jewish tradition to the world. So let me ask you if you have any other questions. And if you do, I am happy to take them, but write them now because we are coming otherwise to the end of our Thursday morning Torah. Going once. Going twice. Well then, I don't see any now. I'm looking down at the Facebook page and I don't see any in the chat. Since nothing is coming in, I will close then with this. The other thing that Sarah and Abraham remind us, and I say this because of all the many challenges that we face right now in our nation as well as in the world, all the many challenges and difficulties and divisions and all of that. The other thing that Sarah and Abraham remind us is you can get through it. God knows they faced extraordinarily difficult things. You can get through it. You may be changed by the experience, but if you have that solid center, you will come out as essentially the same person, deeper, wiser, but the same. So be hopeful and stay safe. And God willing, see you on Shabbat morning and next week.